Would you like a comment?
Yes, I contemplate every day the possibility that there's a very powerful being that just doesn't love us, because that's the way the world appears to me, if there's any being like that at all. I mean, look, the idea that God might have unknown reasons for not intervening to prevent suffering, which he could, we could just as easily say that there's an evil God who permits lots of good things for reasons which we cannot know, that have to do with them leading to higher evils, which we cannot know, right? So maybe every silver lining has a hidden cloud. Maybe every success is necessary for a failure on a grander scale. My point is not that there are such reasons. I'm not here to defend the God of Genesis chapter 6. But the point is that we have no less reason to believe in them than we have to believe in unknowable goods. So the insistence that there must be such goods is just an attempt to save theism at all costs. It's not a response to any independent reasons.
Next question for Dr. Dacy.
Yes, Dr. Dacy, in your case for atheism tonight, you spoke about blind causal mechanism in the context of macroevolution, and you also talked about the notion of there not being an immaterial dimension of man, such as a soul, and then you spoke about goods and evil. My question is, assuming your worldview does provide a basis for morality, how can people still be held accountable if their actions are the results of that which natural law, quote unquote, as opposed to their soul or mind dictates? In other words, why punish a murderer if he's just an advanced weed?
An advanced weed?
Yeah.
That's a good question. That's a good question. There are a couple of questions there. One is, can we make sense of our lives in a naturalistic, materialistic universe? I think we can, and I think more importantly, the idea that there is a soul doesn't really add anything of use. So I pointed out that the soul is a quite mysterious kind of ghost in the machine, because it's not clear at all how it could cause your brain to do anything, because it has no physical properties and your brain has only physical properties. Now, why would you hold a soul accountable for its wrongdoing but not a person? There doesn't seem to be any more moral accountability that inheres in this mysterious non-material substance than inheres in a person. And besides, attributions of blame and praiseworthiness are, in my view, like other judgments, other moral judgments that we make them on the basis of good reasons, or sometimes poor reasons, and we make them so that they will conduce to the best consequences, so that things will go best for us and other people who matter morally. So I can say that a murderer is guilty, and I can be correct in saying so, because attribution of guilt doesn't have to do anything with an immaterial soul, but because a system in which we attribute guilt to murderers works out best for everyone.
Dr. Craig?
I think the question is an incisive one. You can prove that the person, in fact, did commit the murder and is in that sense guilty, but he wouldn't be morally culpable or morally responsible for it, any more than a tree is morally responsible for growing a limb. If we are just electrochemical machines that are determined by our genetic makeup and the input of our five senses, then our moral decisions and actions are no more morally significant than the movements of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of genetic makeup and sensory input. So the reason a soul makes a difference is because a soul has freedom of the will and can therefore choose. But if we are just electrochemical machines, then it's not only difficult to see why we would have moral worth in the first place, but it's even more difficult to see why we would be morally responsible for our actions, because they would all be determined.
Question for Dr. Craig.
Yeah, Dr. Craig, with the Bible being an important tool for a Christian with his or her walk with God, What would you say to Dr. Casey's comment earlier that the Gospels may have been an unreliable source of what the apostles went through or what they actually saw?
Sure. It is frustrating in these debates to have to try to talk in sound bites and not be able to delve into these issues at length. One of the most remarkable things about the current of New Testament criticism is how, compared to, say, a century ago, the trend in criticism is towards seeing the four gospel accounts as fundamentally reliable accounts of the historical Jesus. We know much, much more today about the historical Jesus, though he's a rather minor figure in one sense in history, than we do about most major figures of antiquity. We not only have these four independent sources of Jesus in the Gospels, but we also have the Pauline letters and traditions behind the Acts of the Apostles that provide multiple independent testimony to the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And so the outlines of the historical Jesus, his career, his passion, his death, and so forth, are very widely agreed upon. And in particular, as I indicated, there are several fundamental facts about Jesus that are agreed upon by the majority of New Testament historians today that I think point to the resurrection. The first would be that he was killed by crucifixion under Roman authority. Second, that he was buried by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Thirdly, that tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion. Fourth, that the disciples then and other groups of people on multiple occasions under different circumstances experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. Everybody admits that. Now, as Austin says, some try to explain these away as hallucinations like Ludemann, but everybody admits they had these experiences, these apparitions of Jesus. And then finally, fifth, they came to believe that God had raised him from the dead despite every predisposition in Judaism to the contrary. And I don't know of any naturalistic explanation that provides an overarching explanation of those five facts that is as plausible and historically grounded as the resurrection hypothesis that God in fact raised him from the dead.
Dr. Dacy?
Well, notice that Craig now says that the naturalist has to not only explain each of the three facts, but has to point to a single hypothesis that explains all three facts. Well, of course, this is something that no naturalist could do, but it's not anything that naturalists need to do either. I mean, after all, we don't expect that for other historical explanations. Why did the Civil War erupt? We don't need a single hypothesis that explains all the factors leading up to it. I granted the empty tomb, as you may recall, but I pointed out that there are lots of other scenarios that are not as implausible on the background knowledge as the claim that Jesus was miraculously raised from the dead by God. Does everyone agree that there were appearances to the disciples of Jesus? Well, that's ambiguous. Jesus appeared to the disciples, or the disciples had experiences that they thought were of Jesus. And of course, if the empty tomb was a fact, then it wouldn't take a miracle to explain why people developed stories that he had been found living. After all, we know where Elvis Presley is buried, but people see him all the time.
Let's thank our speakers for a great job.